Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar featuring insights from Ipsos Global Trends, our comprehensive study exploring the forces shaping our New World disorder. Today's presentation is being given by a team of foresight experts, and you can read more about them on the slide in front of you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Philip Ryan, Managing Partner of Ipsos Strategy 3 in the US. Philip, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. Just by way of introduction, you saw I'm joined by a few of our fabulous team today and experts in trends and foresight, and specifically we'll be talking about global trends today. We're all part of a team within Ipsos called Ipsos Strategy 3, and we're a hybrid consulting research agency and innovation lab, and we focus on a variety of different business challenges that our clients are faced with. So everything from corporate and business strategy to brand, to innovation strategy, ESG, and what we're talking about today is trends and foresight. We spend a lot of time thinking about and looking at the world around us, where we've been, where we're going, and how we can help prepare ourselves and our clients and businesses for different futures as they may emerge. And as we do that, we think about where we are in the world today as we think about the global trends in the world around us. And if you look at, let's just say, the last 80 years of history, we've seen a relative period of prosperity post-World War II. We've seen a period of globalization, beginning with the Marshall Plan, beginning with globalized brands. After that, we did have a multipolar world, or a two-polar world for a series of years, but we've also, throughout that's gone, we had a period of American hegemony. We also had a period of economic expansion across the world. We've had rising life expectancy. We've had a slowdown in death rates. We've had an increase in the birth rate, and we're now at 8 billion people on this planet. We're also seen a time of healthcare getting better. And really what we've seen is the last 8 years has been this period of growth in a variety of ways in the world today. But beginning with the pandemic a couple of years ago, and of course our time is all fuzzy because we can't tell what happened in 2019, 2020, and on to today, 2023, but we find ourselves in a world that's not necessarily in crisis mode, but in crises. There's a number of factors at play that are on people's minds. And one of the things we did a couple of months ago, we went out and spoke to people at the end of December around the world, and we asked them to make predictions of what was worrying about them about the year ahead and what they expected to happen in the world. We saw 79% of people expected prices to rise faster than incomes this year in 2023. We saw that 65% expected more extreme weather events than we had last year. We just saw the headline from the UN yesterday in looking at the changes that need to be made in the next 10 years to avoid a 1.5 degree Celsius increase in climate change. We saw people looking at foreign hackers causing IT shutdowns in government and public services in their country, and so a little less than half of us are worried about hackers that cause major systems collapse. And a whopping 48%, nearly 1 in 2 people around the world, think that it's likely that nuclear weapons will be used in a conflict somewhere in the world in 2023. So pretty alarming, and it speaks to the theme of what we started to look at here, and we're going to share with you today is the idea of, are we living in a polycrisis? And so what is a polycrisis? A polycrisis is when you have a series of crises that are all going on at once, and where the sum is potentially more dangerous than any one individual event within that. And so this was coined by Adam Tooze, a professor at Columbia University, and it really speaks to the world we have today. So lots of things going on. In addition to the predictions I just shared a minute ago, we have a lowering of the birth rate. We have a lowering of life expectancy. We have a series of, there's global contraction when it comes to economic growth. So we see a series of things that are on people's minds and that are affecting life around us, how we live our lives, and how businesses operate in the world today. And so we saw 3 themes that have started to emerge. We've got this economic crisis that's hitting our wallets and our hearts. We've all seen the news from banks over the last 10, 11 days. We see this crisis of tensions between global and local, and that's both businesses as well as governments. And we see this climate crisis that we want and we need to solve, but we're not always sure how to do it. And we'll share more on that in a minute. So these are some of the themes that are emerging today as part of today's Polycrisis. But there's also longer term forces that are influencing the world around us that we'll start to look at as we share what we're doing today. But we had taken a step back, in the second half of last year, and we said, there's lots going on in the world around us. There's lots of different things happening. And so let's go out and really try and take stock of the world today, how citizen consumers around the world are thinking about these trends, thinking about these changes. And we went out and we spoke to about 48,000 people around the world. We did research in 50 different global markets, and we didn't just conduct surveys in those global markets. In some places, we went out with clipboards where we didn't have online presence, but we actually had boots on the ground in every single one of these markets. So have these local market analyses that we started to do as well. So really, really went out there. We cover about 70% of the world's population with this. I think it's around 89% of the world's GDP. And the result of doing all of this work, our most ambitious research ever, is a toolkit that we think can help navigate change today. So there's a lot in here. There's going to be a link that will drop into the chat, but you can also find all of this information in ipsosglobaltrends.com. But what we do want to cover today is a quick snippet of our 6 global macro forces and key themes that fit within those. And we're going to share some of the trends that we've started to identify and capture and look at shifts for and signals from as we go through today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Bender, who's going to take us through some of the macro forces and the first one of the trends that we'll share today. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks for that, Philip. So in terms of the macro forces, what we have on the next slide is really a toolkit, as Philip mentioned, of lots of different things that are happening in the world. And these are across 6 different themes, as you see here. So everything from society to technological change, inequality, environmental changes, things that are happening in politics, and of course, well-being. And what we're seeing is that within each of these themes, there are individual forces, and Philip mentioned a couple of them, that are really things that are becoming the new normal, things that are influencing all kinds of sectors, all kinds of consumers all over the world. Now, there is a little bit of difference when you think about these in terms of the impact may vary from consumer group to consumer group or from market to market. But broadly, these are all things that are going to be influencing and impacting consumers and categories over the next 2 to 5 years. So we thought a few of these would be worth highlighting, and there's many more that you can dig into on your own. The first one being aging populations. So as Philip mentioned, this is something that is definitely shaping the way that our brands are coming to market and the way that we think about innovating for consumers and really serving their needs. In the sense that, if you think about how the population is aging in most countries and it's really potentially creating a brain drain for businesses as more people age out of the market, as more people retire, it's starting to put pressure on economies and certainly pressure on social care programs as well as the families who are caring for those individuals. So as we think about the implications of that, it's really something for you to press with your own teams to think about how do your own products and services start to change to suit an older audience who may have unique needs. For example, if you're a CPG manufacturer or a beverage manufacturer, do you have a thought about the kind of caps that can be opened for people with arthritis, if those are the people who are becoming a greater proportion of your audience? So really thinking creatively about how are we adapting to a changing society. The next macro force is really about technology, and this is something that we certainly are seeing across many generations, but especially with younger generations such as Gen Z, who, for example, are starting to push back on technology. And Gen Z in particular are using social media less often than prior years, but we're seeing a broader movement across all age groups that are starting to think about anti-technology, actively considering how to unplug and pushing back on the information overload that has really started to impact our collective attention span. So as you think about this macro force, one of the prompts you can think about with your teams is how can you potentially navigate that tension where we have to be connected in order to work, in order to connect with others, in order to be part of the present world. But if you really want to be disconnected and to be present in your environment and to pay attention, how do you solve that tension with consumers to be disconnected while still connected, or provide moments of disconnection and in real life connection with other people rather than through screens and through technology? The third macro force is about entrenched inequality, and this one is really connected to a lot of the others that we saw earlier on the chart, in the sense that, you know, we're seeing global progress certainly starting to reach pay parity between men and women, slowing down in large part because of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic and many women having to drop out of the labor force. At the same time, we're all familiar with what has happened over the past 3 years of a reckoning with systemic racism and really starting to acknowledge that and talk about and acknowledge longstanding inequities. Not to say that they're all being really rectified, but they're starting to be surfaced more often, and there's a much richer discussion about what that looks like. So as we think about the implications for this, how can you really grapple with and reckon with potentially operating in a culture, in a country, or even in an industry, which we recognize as systemically unfair? Within that environment, how can you as a brand or as a company start to create true equity with your employees, with your consumers, and with everyone in the entire value chain? So as you can see, these are really great prompts to think about the new normal and how things are influencing lots of different categories and lots of different consumers, and a really rich resource for you to use. And the full set is, of course, available in the report. We'll send you a link to that. The second thing that we wanted to talk through, and I'll just talk briefly through the first one, is to give you a sense of some of the trends. So these are a little bit closer in, and on the next page is a snapshot of all of the trends that we've been tracking for the better part of a decade. And what we've been looking at is how these have evolved, how they've been influenced by the macro forces, and how they've started to change and to morph in and of themselves and in response to one another. The first one that I'll talk about is climate antagonism. And this is something that we have been thinking about and tracking over time to really understand what the impact is and how consumer attitudes are changing. And I think we all, especially in the US, you know, we're certainly aware of the increasing rate of climate disasters, unusual weather events related to the warming planet that happened last year. But we're also looking at some of the driving forces, such as overdevelopment and a broader rethinking of institutions and the role that institutions play in our lives. So there are a lot of macro forces that are kind of moving this forward. The net result is that we see that 72%, the majority of Americans, think that we're heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And that's just a little bit shy of what overall global citizens feel at 80%. So it really is becoming the prevalent understanding, the prevalent conversation amongst Americans. If we look at the next page, we also wanted to dive in and understand where this is coming from. And as we broke this down across gender, age, education, there are some differences, for example, in working status, but by and large, what we're seeing is that concern about the environment is really consistent across US groups of this feeling of heading for environmental disaster. So as we think about on the next slide, what that potentially, how that starts to unfold, there's an interesting corollary to this and a tension, because as much as we're concerned about the environment, we don't necessarily know who to trust. And over half of global citizens, including nearly half of Americans, think that even the scientists don't really know what they're talking about on environmental issues. So there's a big trust issue and a big disconnect in terms of what to do about this. We're seeing lots of different countries really react to this, and different portions of markets react to this. The interesting one is that this is certainly happening closer to home. As we saw in Puerto Rico, years of climate change, hurricanes have really started to erode precious beaches. So the impact is very real. But how different markets and people are responding to this is different across markets. So there's a rich treasure trove across all of these trends of signals that we're seeing in all of the markets, and a really great resource for you to think about. The last thing I'll leave you with on this particular trend is a provocation of thought. So if we think that, you know, there isn't one necessarily one right answer in terms of who is responsible and who needs to act in order to address the climate crisis, that it will take concerted effort and coordination across governments, corporations, and citizens. What is your business and your brand doing to cooperate across all of these groups and start to solve for the climate crisis in a real way? So we'll move on to the next trend, and I'll pass it off to my colleague, Sophie.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So let's dive into our second trend, which is called reactions to uncertainty and inequality. Uncertainty has become the only certainty. People in many markets are facing economic instability, changing governments, supply chain disruption, and remaining high inflation. And in every corner of the globe, struggles to achieve parity based on gender, race, ethnicity, and religion dominates headlines. So on this slide, we'll see that because of all this uncertainty and instability, 62% of Americans wish our country was run by a strong leader instead of the current elected government. And this is compared to 60% of global citizens, so really on par with the rest of the world. And we can see here that the forces underpinning this trend include efforts to rethink institutions, systemic health inequality, this will be present in the next trend I cover, an increase in geopolitical conflicts, greater ethnic and religious diversity, the rise and fall of middle classes, and entrenched inequality. And on the next slide, we see that most people in most markets agree that the world is actually changing too fast. But despite the rapid pace of change between 2019 and today, the level of agreement hasn't increased significantly. So we've seen slight increases or decreases by market. So for example, in 2019, 84% of South Koreans agreed with this, and now 88% do. In Germany, it was 74%, now it's 75%. But in some countries like the US and Sweden, we've actually seen a slight decline. So in 2019, 70% of Americans agreed the world was changing too fast, and now 69% do. And we can see this in the data over time, but really the perception is not growing but remains very commonplace. However, global citizens, and especially Americans, can feel the divisiveness in their country. So American sense of national pride is actually lower than the global average. And they further believe that there is more and more conflict between people who do not share the same values in their country. So there's clearly a great deal of concern at both the global and the local level. And when there is uncertainty in markets, there is also an opportunity for political parties to capitalize on the uncertainty, which means that we might see some upheaval in current systems in addition to what we've already seen. For example, many countries have been experiencing the rise of populist parties, like in Costa Rica, where we've seen ongoing inequality that's been a driving factor in propelling a populist economist and political newcomer to the presidency. But on the flip side, and a more positive note, there's also room for innovation in the private sector. So on the next slide, as we can see, as a result, brands in the US can play a really critical role in helping people feel more stable and more valued during turbulent times. And this is especially true when other institutions and systems are not providing this sense of stability. So how we act upon this need really comes down to asking important questions like, how do you deliver consistency to your customers and citizens in the face of uncertainty? So now let's move on to the third trend, which is called conscientious health. We know that health is becoming more holistic, which means it considers multiple meanings of well-being. So for example, we can look across different dimensions like mental or emotional well-being, financial well-being, environmental, social, physical, and many more different types of well-being, and we can create connections between and find links for this overall picture of holistic health. So we can see this interconnectedness in the forces that are underpinning conscientious health, which include systemic health inequality, again, like our previous trend, the growing mental health crisis, really exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, aging populations, which may skew more in certain markets like the US and Japan, pervasive technology and thinking about its detrimental effect on our health, AI advances in quantum computing. So very interesting. We can even consider the vast untapped potential of AI tech like ChatGPT in the medical field. And then similarly, the integration of health and technology. And on the next slide, and while physical health is still important, on the next slide, we'll see that mental health is a priority for most. So 80% agree with the statement, I need to do more to look after my mental well-being. The US actually falls on the lower end of the spectrum here, as you can see. And this is below the global average, with just 69% of Americans agreeing. But we do know that COVID has put pressure on everyone. So on the next slide, so in addition to the pandemic, negative factors over the past couple of years that are also ongoing, for example, economic uncertainty, the climate crisis, global conflict zones, all of these things have added to people's worries. And we can see that around 8 in 10, and this is from all age groups, agree that they need to do more to look after their mental well-being. But actually the most acute need here is among the young. So while 4 in 10 of under 35 strongly agree that they need to do more for their mental well-being, just a quarter of those aged 55 to 74 are saying the same thing. And brands know that an increased global awareness of health and well-being is creating an opportunity to really support people's aspirations for more healthy lifestyles. But there are also some interesting tensions between some historical systems or traditions or economies and emerging attitudes. This could open up and create even greater innovation territory. So for example, in New Zealand, the economy relies heavily on meat exports, yet veganism is now twice as popular there as it was 5 years ago. So we need to pose challenging questions on the next slide, please, to brands as innovators, because we do understand that health is understood as a more holistic system that stretches beyond just the physical body. So for example, one of these questions we can ask is, how does your business in the US or globally support a more holistic view of health, whether it's for your customers, your employees, your community, and the planet? And with that, I'll pass it over to Trevor to walk us through the next 2 trends.
Thank you, Sophie. And I'm very excited to share these. These are 2 of my favorites, so I'd elbow my way in to be sure that I could share these with you. The first one here, search for simplicity and meaning, which obviously has a strong relationship to what we just covered. And just when it felt like our modern life had us feeling like that guy on the previous slide, COVID resulted in a really forced shrinking of people's worlds. So we obviously didn't have our daily commutes, we left our hectic social lives, and we didn't as much have to juggle the frantic kind of commitment game that we're constantly playing every day. However, many people during that time and even now started to reevaluate their lives. They started thinking about their hopes and ambitions. We saw them even adjusting their spending habits and really trying to redefine their lives as something that's maybe smaller, less complex, but still, more fulfilling than it was previously. So some of what's driving that really is that constant pressure from pervasive technology that Jennifer spoke about in the macro forces, that always on effect that we were used to and still in a lot of cases are expected to perform under. Also that war and conflict, obviously the war in Ukraine, as well as just societal conflict that Sophie spoke about, are just 2 of the drivers that are really making people feel overwhelmed. And we see that nearly 2 out of every 3 Americans, they say that they wish they could slow down the pace of their lives. If you go to the next slide, thank you. Looking globally, we see variations from country to country. However, across the markets that we covered in both the 2022 version and the 2021 surveys, we saw the indicators for these desires for simplicity show very little change. So when COVID forced people back into their homes and allowed them to spend more time with family, this obviously also has the adverse effect of cutting down on alone time. Even a commute can offer some significant headspace, time for contemplation. And for others, we also acknowledge that that blur between the work and the home life made it really difficult to switch off, and working mothers, as we saw during COVID, were often more likely to drop out of the workforce than others. So we don't want to paint this as, one way or the other. It was really complex for a lot of people. But today we find that folks are navigating the uncertainty and the complexity of this new normal. So we have daily reminders of our habits and norms having been disrupted. One that's top of mind for us right now would be the working hybrid world. So all of us on the call, we're deciding, should we do the webinar from our home where the Wi-Fi is more stable, or the office where you don't have to worry maybe about the dog barking or someone ringing the doorbell. So those types of conversations are still happening, and we're certainly not out of the complex after effects of the COVID world. On the next slide, we also see that people of all ages feel that their life is too complicated and fast-paced. In both cases, the feeling is slightly less pronounced for people that are age 55 and older, which is to be expected in a lot of ways. They have more control over their daily life and their time, and a little bit more time to reflect and spend time with doing the things that they want to do. But similarly, we see that most people in all age groups place a high value on moments of solitude, which is not surprising and probably a really great thing for our mental health, though this perception is noticeably a little bit lower for the aging population, who of course are more often left alone. On the next slide, I really love this first brand example. How many of us probably rolled over today in bed and immediately grabbed our phones, either to turn off the alarm or maybe check to see if there's anything urgent you have to attend to? And it's really this level of hyper awareness and kind of always on mentality that is a challenge that people are facing day to day. So I really love this brand because it's giving us an alternative to maybe some poor habits that we've developed over the past decade or so. So on the next slide, we all know, it's infinitely harder to make something more simple versus complex, but it's certainly not impossible. And I think that, providing choice can be a really wonderful thing. You really have to balance out the complexity element of that and simplifying choice in that way as well. So we have a couple of prompts here. One is, can you offer employees a good work-life balance while maintaining productivity? What does that benefit look like on both sides of the aisle? How can you enable your end users to find simplicity? So thinking about what that overall user experience looks like, how you can simplify it, how you can maybe spread out the prompts or the different ways that you engage with your customers over time to build that loyalty and that relationship, but without overwhelming folks. And this actually dovetails really nicely into the next trend that I wanted to share with you, which is the tech dimension. So speaking of end users and simplicity, I think that this is one with a lot of promise. And remember, the dawn of the smartphone was in 2007, which isn't that long ago, but sometimes also feels like ages ago. The promise of greater connection, convenience, simplification of our lives was really what ushered that space in. It wasn't quite that simplistic. So the rapid pace of technological change and disruption over the past few decades cannot be understated. But we've learned along the way that what the aim is now, and what I think a lot of people are collectively focusing on, is harnessing the power of technology, but mitigating the risks. So you can see here that upwards of 80 to 90% of folks now have a smartphone. And so it's, a constant part of our lives. 71%, so roughly 7 in 10 Americans can't even imagine life without the internet today. And that's especially true for younger generations that don't actually know a world without it. And while internet is everywhere, we get it, it's in everything, everywhere, all at once. It's obviously handy right now as we speak to all of you live, no matter where you are. But if you go to the next slide, there's a majority across the globe, including 56% of Americans, which you can see highlighted there in yellow, which also believe that technological progress is destroying our lives. So while 71% can't imagine the world without internet, we're still seeing that there's a pretty big majority in most places that believe that there are some major disruptions and quite negative impacts of technology. If you go to the next slide, I want to unpack this a little bit, because I think it's tempting to think of this as maybe older members of society who are most wary of the impact of technology. In fact, we actually see that the reverse is true. So 1/4 of people that are aged 25 to 34 strongly agree that technological progress is destroying their lives, compared with just 18% of those aged 55 to 74. And we can hypothesize that the role of social media potentially in spreading negative information, we see causing alienation in some, depression, anxiety, or lowering user self-esteem, especially in teenage folks. It's been the subject of considerable media attention and research lately, so this could potentially be one of the areas driving this pattern. But it's not all doom and gloom. Technology has in many ways delivered on its promise. So take, for example, this middle signal, the Kitchen Pal app, which I also absolutely love as a cooker and a baker. It's a really great use of technology that digitizes your pantry, but it also syncs with your shopping list. So in one way, it can help you minimize food waste, but it's also a source of inspiration in terms of recipes and what you can actually accomplish with what you have in the house. So it's certainly, you know, the right application of technology can really be a time saver, and it can also do some good in terms of minimizing that food waste. So one of the best ways to navigate the techceleration that we're experiencing is to be very deliberate and strategic about the application of technology. So namely, I think the most important question you can ask yourself is, does it enhance or hurt the customer experience in the certain question at hand? So if you're thinking about maybe how your customers engage with customer service representatives, or if they have a problem, where do they turn to? You know, there are obviously some great applications of always-on customer service with technology, maybe some great avenues for you to build that relationship with folks and get them to see the human side of the brand through real people having a conversation. So again, it's just really taking stock of what tech might be good for and what's not. And we do have one prompt here on addressing that tension between the need for connectedness and the desire to disconnect, how you can give people a choice and help them to navigate that solution. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt, who will take you through the next two trends.
Thanks, Trevor. And I think as we move into the divided world, one of the things we're seeing is, and you're hearing throughout this presentation, is kind of this divide between things are a little doom and gloom in some cases, but there's a little bit of hope in others. And the two trends I'm going to kind of close with today are going to talk about that a lot. So the pandemic was, we hope, a rare event. It could have united the world against a common enemy, but instead forces work to drive and expand wedges between people in many nations about precautions and vaccines. The global Black Lives Matter movement also exposed rifts and divisions and a push for equity, which is a value as a global society we mostly share. Nations taking sides in the war in Ukraine, further driving tensions between the US and China, whose leader was visiting Russia this week, point to a new world disorder with power shifting and new and literal metaphorical backgrounds emerging. And broadly, this polycrisis is both a driver and a result of our new world disorder. So these are some of the macro trends that we see impacting this. These geopolitical forces impacting this trend of a divided world. We see the divided world as a macro global superpower level, but also within nations. France President Macron faced a no confidence vote after a bruising fight over overhauling pensions this week. And in the US, former President Trump is again calling for protests on his behalf in an echo of January 6th as he faces an indictment in possibly 2 different states. We're divided within our local communities as national political rifts drive increasingly contentious school board meetings. And the pandemic and all of this unrest and unease accelerated our rethinking of institutions. It's oversimplified to say we're losing trust. It's more that our relationship to churches, governments, schools, and other institutions is changing. And meanwhile, the demographic makeup of the US is causing further unrest, exacerbated by ongoing economic crisis as the top rungs of the income ladder continue pulling away from the rest of the people. Uncertainty about gas prices, inflation, and now a banking crisis mean that we're feeling very mixed about the economy and our place in it. None of this is a recipe for coming together. And on the next slide, you see that the existence of disagreements on multiple fronts, from climate to human rights, immigration, fiscal policy, gender fluidity, data privacy, around the ethics of artificial intelligence and synthetic biology. It means that it's hard to build a coalition to solve any of these problems and crises. In the US, we mostly, but not entirely, agree that transgender people should be free to live their lives, but anti-trans laws are also being proposed and passed in state after state. Sometimes the fault lines are clear, sometimes new factors align in non-traditional ways on one issue while warring on others. And the technology and tools that connect us are also able to drive us apart. On the next slide, it's really hard to come together when 77% of people think everyone is too easily offended. And so people are looking to brands to play a role in solving these crises and to help them reach their personal goals on issues like sustainability. They want brands to share their values, but many of the issues that brands could take a stand on are fraught with danger. So it's hard for brands to make the meaningful changes their customers want, because not all their customers want the same thing. Fundamentally, we share so many values, and we see that in our data again and again. We get caught up in the expression and implementation of those values, but that leaves room for hope that the forces dividing our world could also help bring it together. The signals from the US aren't hard to find, but elsewhere, the Netherlands barred a COVID-19 vaccine conspiracy theorist from entering the country after he was invited by the far-right political party. And in Poland, Yes, which is a Polish jewelry brand, actively was supporting women's rights and inclusivity, but they had their campaign in Christmas 2021 pulled by the Polish public television system. Yet, its impactful creative work won a Grand Prix Effie Award. So that leads us to the central question of this section on the next slide, that what role, if any, does your brand or organization have to play in relieving some of these tensions in our society where the government cannot? How do you continue to take a stand and align your organization's values with your customers' values? How do you respond to potential backlashes, which we certainly see in the news these days? And President Biden just issued his first veto on a backlash to ESG principles in running corporations. And do you have a role to keep in keeping the peace, enabling a mature and calm debate among those with differing points of view? Now, this slides us right into the final trend we will cover today, peak globalization. The world remains divided on the benefits of globalization. Sure, we've got increased travel, greater cultural exchange, the rise of cheap products. These represent benefits to many people. However, the delusion of local cultures, perceived lifestyle homogenization, increased consumerism, rising emissions, and faster habitat loss are all among the significant impacts of globalization. The supply chain was a surprising and unwitting co-star of the pandemic as a shift towards delivery butted against headline-grabbing disruptions and shortages that impacted lives in big and small ways. Many commentators feel that we've already reached peak globalization and are moving toward a world where protectionist policies, shorter, more secure supply chains, and a greater focus on nationality and local community will create smaller, less globalized landscape. We at Ipsos are less sure. This is one of the trends we see shifting, and while the pandemic drove us to appreciate locally made goods more, as things have returned, we find ourselves missing our global brands, our relationships with them, and the consistency we had grown to expect from products and services. The past year has seen an upsurge in appreciation of benefits of global brands, particularly in Asian and Latin American markets. And in no market do we see the opposite tendency. So this is a trend to watch moving forward. The macro forces impacting this, we know that over the 1990s and 2000s, cheap labor in Asia, coupled with relatively inexpensive, reliable global shipping, drove consumerism and fueled the march of globalization. But the growth of the middle class in China drove up labor costs, and government focused on more lucrative industrial sectors, and manufacturers switched to offshore markets. So COVID-19 and global conflicts put a huge pressure on the global supply chains and forced manufacturers and retailers to prioritize resilience and agility of supply through tactics like nearshoring and friendshoring. On the next page, we see that in the data, people around the world think positively about the idea of greater commonality, greater global mobility and exploration, and globalization in general. They're a little more ambivalent when it comes to international commerce, and with the advocates and rejectors almost exactly balancing each other out at a global level, at least. These feelings are strongly linked to the economic development of nations and the living standards of their population. Of the top 20 countries we see here ranked in terms of how much they feel globalization is good for their country, 10 are in Asia, 6 in Latin America, and 3 in Middle East Africa. Only New Zealand falls outside of these emergent regions, and the US is split evenly on sentiments. So for corporations, the issue is complicated by the need to balance lower production costs with unstable supply chains. And the outcome is an effort to stabilize supply via nearshoring, often presented as an effort to support local economies. Most Americans prefer to buy American. In other Ipsos data, it's one of the top purpose-based reasons people choose one product over another. And it's a complicated trend in itself, with economic, nationalistic, patriotic drivers swirled with a sense that we make better, higher quality stuff here, And we want to support our community and neighbors who make and sell those projects. On the next slide, globally, we see shifts in production as companies look to shore up supply chains and appear more local in some cases. Just this week, we saw a story about India reviving its local cola brand to compete against Pepsi and Coca-Cola, combining this local trend with feelings around nostalgia that we cover elsewhere in Global Trends. Danone has restructured to become a local first company. Apple has been shifting its production from China to India. Under Armour has moved out of China in favor of other countries, so is Hasbro. And they all feel like this is working well for them. So finally, on the next slide, it may be that the reduced availability of certain international brands because of COVID-19 and conflict-based pressures on global supply chains forced people to reluctantly do without certain types of products or to use brand alternatives that they didn't perceive to be of the same quality. So where does your organization belong to the global to local continuum? And can or should this positioning be flexed? Knowing that people do value, how can a global brand make a meaningful impact within their local community? Is your supply chain optimized to stay agile in the short term and resilient in the long term? Do you have the right balance between offshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring? Have you adopted multi-sourcing practices to safeguard your raw materials? And do you truly know what your customers value more? The sustainability and reliability of speed of supply that comes with local production, or the lower costs of a more global approach? All of the trends we've talked about today are just scratching the surface of this rich data set. And frankly, they all beget great questions to research for your brand. So to take us home and talk a bit about how you can activate these trends in your organization, I'm going to hand it back to Philip Ryan.
Thank you, Matt. So in summary, that's 7 trends, and we've covered a couple of the macro forces that we have in our full report. There's a lot more that's in there. There's another 5 trends you can look at for each of the 7 we even covered today. There's lots more data in there. There's lots more signals. We've got things from all corners of the world and signals we can use to inspire your brand or also give additional ideas. Lots more data sets in there as well. So there's a lot that we can look at. But if I was to let you all take away a couple of big things from this, because we talk about the polycrisis, we talk a lot about change, we'll talk about a lot about all these things that are happening. What we really need to expect is that more change and disruption are going to happen in the future. As our CEO, Ben Page, likes to talk about, is we're in this era of what he calls the twitchy 20s, where there's a lot of different things going on. People aren't sure, brands, businesses, governments, citizens aren't sure whether to turn left or right or up or down or what have you. And so there's a lot more change and disruption that's in the future. So what will your brand do? For the last 10 years, we've heard from brands time and time again, probably even 15 years, is we need to be disruptive. We need to disrupt our consumers' lives. We need to do things that are different. What I would say is we're entering an era with all this change, disruption that's happening around all of us. Maybe don't chase disruption. Chase steadfastness. Chase solutions that help to make sense of all of this, that help to simplify people's lives, that help them to manage through all of these different crises, this polycrisis, this twitchy 20s that's happening all at once. Look at ways to do that rather than look at additional ways to disrupt your consumers. If there's one thing, I'd love you to all take that away. But there's a bunch of other ways that we can use this Ipsos Global Trends data. So there's a few things that are available, easy for all of you to get. So there's the top line global report. It's text heavy. It's got all the trends. It's got the global data. It's got the macro forces. So go to ipsosglobaltrends.com to get that. I think we might even drop a copy of that into the chat here. There's a video about the Ipsos Global Trends that's available on the microsite as well. And then we're also in the middle of launching a series of sector-specific insights and white papers that we're going to be launching in the coming months that might be interesting for any of your takeaway brands as well. There's a few other ways that you can actually start to use these internally at your organizations as well. One, and we find is very helpful, is we're all, many brands are starting to think about their strategic planning process. What are they going to do for the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? This is great input into any of your strategic planning sessions. That could be for your brands, it could be for your businesses, it could be for research and insights teams, but as well as other teams, it could be for people who are in charge of finance or operations, etc. There's a wealth of information in here to start to think about It could be inspiration for white space innovation. We can do workshops and ideations to help you with all of that, but or of course use all of that on your own. It's great content for lunch and learns that could inspire your team. Take 1-2 trends, take your teams through it, talk about some of those assumptions, talk about some of those implications. And then of course it's great, these are great ingredients for foresight scenarios. So we've talked a lot about trends today, but those same macro forces, those shifts that we're seeing, are equally useful for starting to think about future scenarios and ways that the world might unfold in the coming decade. If any of you want support, details on any of these things, always happy to talk, any one of us who've been presenting today. But that's essentially all we have. We hope we've inspired all of you. We hope we haven't scared all of you with the changes that we're talking about here. We personally feel that there is a lot of opportunity out there. There's a lot of scope for brands to make headway, to make progress, and to help their customers to navigate all of this. With that, let me hand it back over to Ellen to close us out.
Wow, I would just very much like to thank our speakers today, Philip, Jennifer, Matt, Trevor, and Sophie, for today's really timely presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, we will do so by email. And of course, we always welcome the opportunity to speak with you directly, so please reach out. That now concludes today's Ipsos webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.